This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
Is gut health important when you're looking at performance?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you're not doing like the carbohydrate thing with these endurance events, what is the approach then that you're taking?
So the approach is to become fat adapted, and what that means is you can access your body fat for fuel.
Where do you see the future of health?
I think my child's generation are going to be the healthiest yet.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the healing journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? Welcome to the Expert Series, where you'll meet 25 of the world leaders in health and wellness, discussing their passions and what it takes to make your shift.
There's an electrical feeling in the room.
I had to be a mom. It was so important to me.
I've always been a pain in the butt, and I love that.
I knew that I wanted to help people.
I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift.
Hi, I'm Katherine Maslen, naturopath, author and host of The Shift. In the Expert Series, we share the insight, stories and expertise of each of our amazing experts. You might have heard them on season 1 of The Shift, where we took snippets of these interviews and put them together into the series for you. If you haven't listened to season 1 yet, I'd highly recommend listening to episode 1 of this podcast to get the latest on what it takes to make a shift in your gut health. We'll provide a link in the show notes. In this episode, we have Australian nutritionist Steph Lowe. Steph is a powerhouse of knowledge and is known for her work with performance and endurance athletes. Also known as the Natural Nutritionist, Steph is the author of several books, including The Real Food Athlete and Low Carb Healthy Fat Nutrition. Steph is a regular media commentator and host of the podcast The Real Food Real. She is a passionate health advocate, and you'll hear her passion come through in this interview. Listen out for Steph's story of how food healed her through her depression and disordered eating, and how she learned was turned on its head. Steph was also about to give birth when I interviewed her, so we have some great conversations about what a nutritionist does to support their baby's health leading up to birth. Let's get right into the interview.
Hi, my name is Steph Lowe, the Natural Nutritionist. I built the Natural Nutritionist back in 2011 to teach the world how to eat real food.
Awesome. And so tell me, what kind of nutritionist are you?
So I am a real food nutritionist, and the focus is on food in its natural whole food state. So food that comes out of the ground, off a tree, or from an animal.
Oh, I love that. That's fantastic. Tell me, what's the difference between a nutritionist and a dietitian?
The difference between a nutritionist and a dietitian is slightly to do with the training. You know, dietitians definitely do a little bit more clinical placement towards the end of the degree, but they are governed by the Dietetics Association in Australia, and that definitely shapes some of the information that they have to deliver to their clients, whereas we have a little bit more flexibility and we're able to step away from things like the dietary guidelines and the food pyramid in the West.
Let's get a little bit of background on you first. So tell me, where are you from?
I am from Melbourne in Victoria, but I grew up in Townsville in North Queensland.
And what was the journey that led you here?
I came back to Melbourne actually to study nutrition at a postgraduate level, so it wasn't available where I did my undergrad. So I packed up when I was 21 and worked in the industry, in the health industry, but then returned to study in 2009.
Why did you want to study nutrition?
For me, I had a really interesting personal journey with nutrition that starts far back as a teenager. It's kind of a long story, but it was definitely an interest that unfortunately turned into quite a disordered relationship with food. And I had lost 20 kilos. And as a teenager, my mum was naturally really worried. She took me off to see a dietitian. And I still remember to this day sitting in that consult thinking, how cool is this lady's job? She gets to sit there and talk about food. And that was the catalyst that sort of inspired me to learn more, but eventually go back and study so I could practice as a nutritionist.
When was the moment when you knew that you wanted to help people?
The moment was definitely more to do with my personal experience that started with going gluten-free. So I had a lot of mental health issues and I didn't actually get a diagnosis, but in hindsight, I can really see that it was depression. And I met someone who challenged me to go gluten-free. He knew a lot more about gluten than I did at the time. And he encouraged me that starting to remove gluten could be a way for me to improve my mental health. And I was very skeptical at the time. I didn't know much about gluten and the impact of the gut and the brain and the whole intricate relationship that we know in this day and age. But I was pretty desperate. So I went gluten-free. And, whilst it took some time, it was the catalyst for me to move into a real food template, so to stop calorie counting and eating low fat, but it really transformed my health. So to have that significant personal experience was the inspiration for me to want to be able to share that journey with others, but help them use food as medicine.
So tell me, what was it like then growing up like with these health issues and going through that journey at quite a young age?
Yeah, as a teenager, I first remember it being really challenging because I felt like the fat, ugly child. And so I turned to food as a solution to try and fix that experience and what I thought I looked like. Then, unfortunately, it became very obsessive, so it consumed every waking hour. I feel really sorry for my parents looking back because I never wanted to eat, dinner with the family because I was really afraid of everything that was fat. So I was, living off, tuna and spring water and salads with low-fat salad dressing, and I really did move away from enjoying food in that social and family type environment. So, it was pretty rocky, and losing a lot of weight I thought was going to be the answer to my sadness, to my unhappiness. And I do remember getting to 49 kilos and having this epiphany that I still wasn't happy and that my weight actually wasn't going to solve the issue.
Wow. So would you say that you had an eating disorder of sorts?
Yeah, definitely. I call it disordered eating just because I didn't get the clinical diagnosis. But yeah, absolutely. Looking back, it was, definitely trapped in the whole calorie counting and low fat era. It was the 90s. That's what we did, yeah. But it was definitely, all consuming, and it was really unhealthy. I didn't have a menstrual cycle for 7 years. And we know that one of the major building blocks of our brain is or are fats. So naturally you can see how things started to unravel both from a hormonal point of view and definitely from a mental health point of view.
So I'm sitting across from you and you're pregnant right now and you look amazing and you're glowing and the baby's about to pop out of you. So obviously there's been a lot of healing to get to this point. What was your healing journey like through this? What are some of the insights and things that happened along the way?
Yeah, for sure. So like I said, the catalyst was gluten-free, but that really opened up my world to looking at what I was eating, rather than it being about calories or low calorie or counting numbers. I shifted to quality, so food quality, so understanding real food, in its natural whole food state, out of the ground, off a tree, from an animal. And one of the first things that you do experience is how different you feel when you're nourishing your body. I went from counting down the minutes, literally being so consumed by food, but also so hungry that I needed to eat every 2 hours. So that vicious cycle just continued because I was consumed by food every 2 hours. Moving to a real food template, naturally you have much greater blood sugar control. You can actually detach from food because you're not needing to eat so often. And for me, I love sharing that lesson with my clients and with my wider audience because we are still in a world that tells us to snack or to eat every 2 hours. And that's just one of the many myths that I like to bust, because we can take control of our health with real food, but the flow-on effect is definitely how we feel day to day and meal to meal.
Tell me a little bit more about being consumed by food and how that shows up for people.
Yeah, great question. So I think in terms of the being consumed by food, it was definitely, all right, I've had that breakfast, let's say, when am I going to eat again? All right, I know that quote unquote can't eat until 11 o'clock, but because you're not nourishing your body and you're essentially in starvation mode, it's really challenging to not think about food. It's like when someone tells you not to think about the elephant in the room, it's naturally always on your mind, but counting down the clock to that next meal and then just thinking about what I would eat in the next 2 hours and so on and so forth, but also, you know, counting calories. So everything was a mathematical equation in terms of, you know, what can I eat for the rest of the day that would still keep me under the magic 1,200 calories so I could stay thin, because that was what I thought my solution was at the time.
This is a really big conversation that I've been having with people, and one of the episodes is going to be on emotional wellness, emotional eating, and all of the stuff that sort of comes with that. What do you think the net effect is of being in that emotion stress state constantly around food?
Yeah, I mean, we know the impact of stress on our overall health, but specifically digestively, I think, you know, when we're stressed, our blood flow is naturally going out to the heart, legs and lungs because we are in that fight, flight or freeze state. So unfortunately, it usually comes with some associated digestive issues. So for me, I had quite a long history of irregular bowels, bloating, and what I thought were a lot of sort of food intolerances, like I couldn't eat A and I couldn't eat B. But a lot of it I can see in hindsight was wrapped up in that really negative relationship around food that had the associated stress and the impact on my physiology. And that's what I teach my clients about. Like, we don't like to talk about, you know, removing individual foods longer than, you know, obviously necessary. It's about, you know, healing those deeper layers so that you can have a really healthy gut and digestive system and essentially tolerate nearly everything.
You've heard a lot of client stories throughout this series, and you might be wondering if we could perhaps help you. Supporting people to shift is what we do best. Health is a journey, and we can help you to navigate this with one-on-one support with our clinical naturopaths, hypnotherapists and counsellors. If working with us one-on-one interests you, go to theshiftclinic.com and click on Shift with Us.
The Shift!
How did you get into performance nutrition?
I had a little bit of a stint partying as a 20-year-old and realised that definitely wasn't the kind of life that I wanted to lead. And a way to get out of that for me was to jump into racing triathlon. So I had some friends that were into the sport, and what they did on a Sunday morning was train. They would swim and ride and run. They weren't like hungover or still like getting home from their night out like I did for a little while. So I started to experiment with what was initially like sprint distance, so we call that short course triathlon, and eventually start to do longer distance where you're in these pack rides and everyone's sucking down on sports gels. And I remember not knowing anything about sports gels, coming back from a long ride and, you know, being, you know, falling off the back, hitting the wall, not having any energy. And one of the coaches forcing me to have this gel, this sports gel, like to get home, quote unquote. And I can still remember the taste, this, you know, the sweetness, the artificial flavors, just how horrific it was that I just knew there had to be another way. I also then spoke to a lot of athletes who are experiencing either a similar experience in terms of the taste, but a lot of those digestive issues that we associate with endurance sport as being normal, when we look at the ingredients and the high fructose content and the artificial nature of these sports gels, we can see why we're not tolerating them from a, you know, a human digestive point of view. So I actually started to learn a little bit more about what was the alternative. So rather than relying on sugar and fueling a metabolism that is sugar burning in nature, we actually have another choice. If we can tap into our natural, you know, evolutionary metabolism and burn fat for fuel, it has some really amazing performance and longevity benefits. So I actually dived into the research to start to look at how I could reframe things. And like along the way, we were just creating our own recipes because we didn't want to use those sports gels. But it quickly evolved into a passion of mine that I wanted to teach other people that they didn't need to be perpetuating this sugar burning environment and using all of the products that we've been led to believe will make us be faster or fitter, which is quite a fallacy, in fact.
Because it's quite a culture, isn't it? Like, you know, if you are any type of endurance athlete, that you have to have the Gatorade or you have to have the gels or that type of thing. And I would say, like, when you're looking at sort of the low carb, high fat type lifestyle, that there would be a lot of athletes that would just find that absolutely outrageous. Have you found it difficult to kind of cut through to people with this stuff?
It's a really interesting question because, as I mentioned, I started the Natural Nutritionist in 2011. And in 2011, we still thought that saturated fat would give us heart disease. We still thought that we needed to avoid, most fats. It was all still very calorie counting and snacking focused. Now, there's definitely been a real food revolution and a great change in countries of Western nature. But you're right, it's taking a lot of time because people know what they know. So they know carbohydrates, they know the food pyramid, they know the Gatorade, and they know the gels. So it does flip their world upside down to learn there's another way. But I think when you explain the options from a metabolic fueling point of view, when they understand the impact of refined sugar, they start to actually come on board. And when they experience it firsthand, it's rare they'd ever go back.
Is gut health important when you're looking at performance?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a typical endurance sense, in a fueling environment, we're told to have 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. But we're also swimming and riding and running. So the blood flow's going out to the heart, legs and lungs, and we're trying to put these huge volumes of carbohydrates and refined ingredients into our gut. And it's a very obvious game of tug of war, which ends in disaster. And most people think that the gastrointestinal distress that we see in endurance sports is normal. But that's a byproduct of the sugar burning metabolism and needing to fuel so much.
Tell me about the gastrointestinal distress that people who do these type of sports are familiar with.
It's very common to have athletes vomiting on the side of a race because they're trying to put the 60 to 90 grams in hour after hour after hour. It's very common to see a lot of diarrhea and issues with people running off to the bushes. So they spend 16 weeks training for this event that comes undone on race day because they're in the toilet or they're in the bushes. And you laugh about it and everyone laughs about it, in jest, but it's such a waste of everyone's time and investment. And it's so unnecessary when we know that it's completely avoidable if we learn to become a fat burner and if we learn to fuel as nature would have intended.
So if you're not doing like the carbohydrate thing with these endurance events, what is the approach then that you're taking?
So the approach is to become fat adapted. And what that means is you can access your body fat for fuel. So we've essentially got, two tanks to choose from. We've got the carbohydrate tank, which is muscle glycogen that we store in the muscle. It's very unlimited. We're lucky if that will last us 2 hours. So obviously if we're exercising, training, racing beyond 2 hours, we have to put the carbohydrates in. So it's the exogenous fuel that tops up that tank. Then on the other hand, if we are a fat burner or if we become fat adapted, we've got essentially an unlimited tank of fat available. So most people have more than 100,000 calories of energy stored. They just can't access it when they're consuming all the carbs and all the sugars and eating a Western food pyramid. So when you've got access to that fat, you've got unlimited fuel, but you can still have smaller amounts of carbohydrates coming in because they're smaller molecules. They're faster to break down. They're more readily available when you're in a training session of higher intensity, and especially race day when there is going to be a higher intensity component. So it's definitely not no carbohydrates, but it might be half or 1/3 of the amount that you needed when you were a sugar burning athlete. We also then avoid fructose because that is the most inflammatory sugar. And it is the sugar that causes all the water to be drawn in the gut, which goes out either end when we have that gastrointestinal distress.
So what do you recommend for people on race day? What kind of sugars?
On race day, we use mostly glucose. Some people do prefer store-bought over homemade. But if it's homemade, you can use like a glucose such as a rice malt syrup. And I have a recipe known as Freedom Fuel, which is a gel that's homemade. So it's fructose-free intentionally. But we also include ingredients like MCT oil, so medium chain triglyceride oil just to help the blood sugar, because everyone that's had a gel knows how it feels. You get the huge spike of sugar and the crash on the other side, which is why the packet tells you to take 3 every hour, because of that blood sugar impact. Versus when you're looking at natural fuel and you're adding that smaller amount of a quality fat, you're stabilizing the blood sugar. So you're getting more out of that fuel and therefore, again, needing less. There are options like certain brands such as Generation UCAN. They do a super starch that's corn derived, but it's heat treated to, again, stabilize the blood sugar impact. So no peaks and troughs, delayed energy delivery, and it supports that fat burning environment that we're trying to create.
Can you give me an example of a client of yours where working on their digestive health has directly impacted on their performance or other areas of their life?
I can think of so many clients, but I'll use one example. And this particular athlete was the inspiration behind creating the recipe for Freedom Fuel. So she is an endurance athlete who lives and breathes triathlon, but was always experiencing a lot of digestive issues, trying to put a round peg into a square hole and use the goos and use the Gatorade and try and consume the 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour in a very small frame. Like, we're forgetting that these guidelines aren't even relative to body weight some of the time. And so we worked together to develop her fueling strategy. And she was one of the first sort of case studies that I used to test out some of the recipes and to formulate a strategy that was nearly half of what she had been using. And it was life-changing for her. Her runs, like her training sessions, used to have to be around where she knew toilets were. So running a track where she knew there were particular toilets along the way, or going to a track where she wouldn't get caught with her pants down in the bushes. And that can be very stressful, and it's not enjoyable, and it's definitely not a way to spend your time doing a sport that you love. So by removing the fructose, reducing the overall carbohydrate load, and doing all the heal and seal and prebiotic and probiotic work, so the real foundations, we completely transformed her endurance experience, and she now can race with no worries about toilet stops, and is very well fat adapted. So when you're looking at Ironman level, so events that might take someone 12, 13 or more hours, it just changes their whole experience. They don't need to worry about, how am I going to possibly carry this picnic basket worth of food with me? And you become really self-sufficient, and the event ends up being about racing, not about eating or fueling, which it is for so many people that have these requirements that they're trying to put in their mouth hour after hour.
So what does a healthy diet look like to you? A diet that supports gut health and all of the microbes that live in there?
Yeah, so I think our diet really needs to be plant-centric. So, I teach a bit of a concept called Build Your Plate, which is really starting to look for how we can build our plate starting from about 2 cups of non-starchy veggies. So non-starchy veggies are lots of greens, but we always want to eat the rainbow. So colours are really important for that diverse array of vitamins and minerals and antioxidants and polyphenols. And it's really nice to see a rainbow coloured plate. So 2 cups of vegetables, quality protein is really important. So that can be plant or animal. But when we talk about animal protein, it's really important that we look at the sustainability and ethical nature of what protein we source. So grass-fed, pasture-raised, free range. And I think in the West, we tend to eat about twice as much protein as we need. So I like to use the palm method, so a palm-sized serve of protein per meal. And then we look for what complementary healthy fats we can add to the plate. As a general rule, we start with between 2 to 4 tablespoons, and that's something that's really individual, and you'll test parameters like your ongoing satiety, appetite control, craving management. It will be individual to your exercise output, how much you're burning as well. But the 2 groups of fats that we like to build our plate from are, of course, our omega-3s. So our really anti-inflammatory fats such as avocado, olive oils, nuts and seeds. But then thankfully our good friends saturated fats are no longer demonized. We're looking for grass-fed butter. You can have quality animal fats. You might use coconut oil or MCT oil, but they need to be complementary to our omegas rather than the other way around, which some people tend to get a little bit carried away with. And then we talk about whole food carbohydrates having a time and a place. So whole food carbohydrates are fruit, starchy veggies. You might be suited to quinoa or buckwheat. But we don't need to eat too many of those foods. If we're sedentary, we need a lot less. If we're definitely doing more high-intensity activity, then we need more. But they are a great recovery fuel. So we'd like to encourage the consumption of these more complex carbohydrates in the meal that we eat within the hour post-training. And it's a great way to include those foods because nobody doesn't enjoy a carbohydrate, but we tend to eat a little bit too much of those foods in the West. From a gut health point of view, we cover our prebiotics with our non-starchy veggies, but also the complex carbohydrates when we're including our cooked and cooled sweet potato, or basmati rice. We obviously can reheat those foods, but they provide us with a beautiful resistant starch, which feeds the trillions of bacteria that largely live in the large intestine. Probiotics are going to come with a conscious effort to include things like fermented foods or cultured coconut yogurt, milk kefir or coconut kefir, depending on your dietary preferences. And then, we need to be including some kind of heal and seal nutrient like broth or collagen powder. But I don't think you can beat bone broth when it comes to nature's superfood. It's just a way of, for some people, they find that quite polarizing to start. So we tend to use it as we would stock initially and then work to find a way to include it in a more sort of greater frequency.
I hope you're loving the information in the shift as much as I do. But maybe you're thinking, what do I need to do for me? Take our online assessment to discover what your gut is up to. Go to theshiftclinic.com/quiz.
The Shift!
What are the foods would you say to definitely avoid when you're looking at gut health?
When it comes to gut health, we definitely avoid things like gluten. People are very polarized to hear that, and many dietitians will tell you it's dangerous to cut out gluten unless you're a diagnosed celiac. But, we've seen the research. Alessio Fasano has clearly proven the link between gluten and the production of zonulin affecting our tight junctions and contributing to the increased intestinal permeability, otherwise known as leaky gut. And that's been proven in the literature, but again, we're being brainwashed by either who we listen to or the food pyramid still telling us that, wheat-based cereals are essential for fibre and digestive health and that whole colon cancer conversation that we see happening in the West. In line with that is refined sugar. It's highly inflammatory. It creates a big cascade to not only interrupt the permeability of the gut, but it feeds the pathogenic bacteria and it completely shifts the microbiome in the direction of ill health rather than feeding the beneficial bacteria. And then, of course, we have to look at trans fats and our seed oils or our high omega-6 oils like the canola and sunflower and safflower that were very big throughout the 80s and early 90s. Anything inflammatory is going to impair the gut, but it's definitely also going to shift the bacteria in that direction of ill health. And we want to look to provide this flourishing environment. Like I like to look at the gut as a rainforest. So if you visualize that, it's small plants and big plants and diversity and colour and it's alive and it's well. So that's not going to come from these quote unquote food-like products that don't have any real nutritional value. So that's why real food can be a really great foundation. If I work with a client, we're not starting on probiotics. We're starting with real food. That is the foundation of building that rainforest. And food diversity is number one. We get caught up in kombuchas and that industry and we get carried away with buying expensive supplements. But without food diversity, we can starve that rainforest. So we've got to be building our gut health from this pyramid and looking at where our priorities lie.
Now, you're about to have a baby, so your little one's going to inherit your microbiome.
Sure is.
What kind of things have you been thinking about? Have you been doing anything differently to kind of leading up to the birth to consider that?
I think being a nutritionist, I was already in a really lucky or well-educated position before I decided that Ian and I were going to have a baby. But I did a specific 3-month cleanse. So it was more of a gut health focus where I really for me personally, it was just a step up from what I was already doing. So just being really focused on getting in my 1 or 2 cups of bone broth every day. I wasn't drinking alcohol or eating any inflammatory foods, and really just being more consistent with my prebiotics and preparing my resistant starch and looking for diversity in the cultured foods that I was consuming. So smaller amounts of other options rather than just getting too focused on one product or one pill. So we're getting that diversity and that focus. From there, pregnancy is different. Until you experience it, you don't really know what you would do. I definitely haven't been perfect with my food, but I don't eat gluten, I don't eat refined sugar, and I don't eat trans fats or seed oils. So outside of that, I could definitely say I've eaten sort of more quality carbohydrates, whether it's from a vegetable or a buckwheat bread or something along those lines. But at the same time, for me personally, with my history of disordered eating and a very focused 10-week, for want of a better word, program towards my wedding, this is just a nice chapter for me. It's like a different season with my food. And it's really lovely to focus on growing the best human that you can, but also doing it in a really balanced sense. Because I have too many mums that come to me that think they need to stay LCHF and that they need to count their macros it's just not the time and the place to be even considering taking things to that level. It's really nice to be able to stay focused on what you're achieving, but do it in a really healthy, balanced way. And that's been my biggest takeaway.
So when you're pregnant, as I have been, I guess it's a time when you start thinking about not just yourself, but your child's future and what's going to happen. Where do you see the future of health?
I think my child's generation are going to be the healthiest yet. I'm really confident that we've learnt the lessons of the past, and I feel for the generation above me, like my parents' generations and those in the generation above, because they only know low fat and big food, and we see the health consequences of that. But since the real food movement and the education that I have personally and where we're going in Australia, we're going to see a huge shift in the right direction. Now, they're still going to have the marketing and the social media and the challenges to deal with, but my mum thought she was doing best feeding me low-fat K-Time bars as a snack. That's not going to happen in our generation. We've got the knowledge now and we can pass that on and go full circle to what our great-grandparents or what the generation before did, which was before the Industrial Revolution and before we had supermarkets and canning and all the convenience that has caused a lot of the problem that we see today. So I think it's really exciting, especially when I feel like, now I've learned this and I will continue to learn firsthand. As you probably do with your clients, we can spread the knowledge about how to feed a child, and you don't have to go down the rice cereal route like we're told in that space. There are so many other options, and which food when is something that I'm really looking forward to learning firsthand and being able to share with my audience, because that obviously shapes your child's health, and there's so much in our control that we've given away up until now.
It's really interesting because I'm a specialist in fertility, and it wasn't until I had a baby that I really got it, the whole pregnancy, baby stuff. So I'm really interested to see what you come out with. I think it's going to be excellent. This program's called The Shift, right? And it's called The Shift because we're looking at people shifting from where they don't want to be to where they want to be, and the journey that happens as a result of that. So that might be in health, in life, in relationships, in mindset, that type of thing. What's been the biggest shift that you've had in your life?
The biggest shift for me was understanding the power of real food. It really was. I was in a trap where food was the enemy and everything in a packet that was low fat was on my plate or approved, to understanding the healing power of real food, which then completely changes how you look at food, your choices, and how you feel as a result. And it's a simple concept, but it's so powerful when you experience it firsthand, because we choose our food multiple times a day. It's one of the most important decisions we make.
How did you feel when you realised that you weren't trapped by that anymore?
I remember feeling really empowered, but just, desperate to learn more. It just became a really big passion of mine. So the other thing that the epiphany created for me was it filled this void. I think, part of my sadness and part of my mental health issues were associated with not having a purpose in life, and learning that firsthand, understanding the power of real food, deciding to go back and study so I could teach that to others, unlocked this major passion of mine that I know I'll have in my life forever. And that for me is a really important part of health and wellness, having something that gets you out of bed every morning, that makes you feel alive, that you love to share and do, whether you get paid for it or not, was one of the missing pieces for me. And that's something that I talk to my clients about as well. Like, you don't go to a nutritionist expecting to talk about your passions, but health is more than just what you eat. And for me, learning that was amazing, because I think a purpose in life is really important. And I'm a bit of a quote queen, but I always remember, for years, I was like, the purpose of life is a life of purpose. And I still remember it, and I just think about it all the time because it's made such a big difference to my life.
Tell me, if you had just one piece of advice to give someone that wanted to make a shift in their health, what would it be?
I think the biggest thing we can do is change what we eat first thing in the day. I don't believe that breakfast needs to be at 7 a.m, but I do believe that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Understanding that it can be at any time of the day. I think we can get really caught up in trying to do everything, or we're learning about kombucha, or we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, that we can get that analysis paralysis, or get to the point where it's just not sustainable. Whereas looking at health as an evolution and starting with one small step can be a huge catalyst. So moving away from conventional Western breakfast and looking for ways that we can get plants or vegetables in for that first meal of the day, whether it's a smoothie or a frittata that we've pre-made. It's not a coincidence that we then go on to make more positive choices. Everything is connected. The whole crash in the afternoon or the 3:30-itis that we joke about is a byproduct of our previous food choices. So when we start our day with the right blood sugar control, we nourish our body, we will feel like we can achieve at work, or we can exercise after work, or we can be a great parent. The flow-on effect is so positive from such a simple choice as to how we start the day.
Steph is such a wealth of knowledge, and I'm sure you got something from listening to this episode. Let's take a look at a few of the key points. Number 1, I loved how Steph said that a real food nutritionist is someone that focuses on the food and its natural whole food state. So food that comes out of the ground or off a tree or from an animal. This foundation of real foods is what all of us need to be looking to, no matter what specific diet we may be following. Number 2, look at food quality, not counting calories. We've been conditioned to look at energy as calories in and calories out, but really this reality is far from the truth. It is the individual foods that you choose to eat rather than their calories that makes the biggest difference. Number 3, becoming fat adapted means that we switch from using carbohydrates as our main source of energy to using fats. Your body will use both, but it normally favours carbohydrates. By adjusting to a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, you can become fat adapted, which means that your body burns fats over carbohydrates. There have been many studies on this approach, particularly when it comes to the most extreme of this, the ketogenic diet. Check in with a naturopath or nutritionist who can help guide you through this process and let you know if it is appropriate for you. Learning is great, but doing is better. Here are 3 things that you can do as a result of listening to this episode. Number 1, I know I talk about support a lot, but it is just so essential. If you haven't seen a qualified clinical nutritionist or naturopath before and you're confused about your diet, this is where I would recommend that you start. This is particularly important if becoming fat adapted is something that appeals to you, because there are specific dietary changes that are going to make sure that you're not harmed in the process by eating the wrong foods. Number 2, One way to reduce carbohydrates in the diet is to focus on grain-free, savoury meals. You might do a mince and veggie fry for breakfast or snack on cucumber sticks and guacamole rather than going for something sweet. Even swapping out a few high carbohydrate meals for healthy low carb ones in the everyday diet will help to steer you in the right direction. Number 3, make sure your first meal of the day is healthy. This is going to set you up to continue to eat healthy during the day. I'd also suggest to try and keep your breakfast at the same time every day. This helps your body to maintain homeostasis or balance more easily. When we eat at random times each day, it makes it difficult to get into a healthy state of metabolism and energy production. I really enjoyed chatting with Steph, and I hope that you got something that helps you to progress. To find out more about Steph or purchase her books, go to thenaturalnutritionist.com.au or follow her on Facebook or Instagram at The Natural Nutritionist. This is the second last episode of the Expert series, so what's next? Myself and the team are currently working on season 2 of The Shift, which is all about emotional health. Make sure you subscribe so that you know when it lands. Also, keep an eye out for some mini-series I'll be releasing between now and season 2. I've got some great things that I want to share, and I know you'll just love it. If you're not on the list, follow us on social media at The Shift Clinic or on my Katherine Maslen pages, where we will be shouting from the rooftops once it is released. In the next and final episode of the Expert series for season 1, we have celebrity chef and health advocate Pete Evans. This isn't what you'd expect by this chef known as the Paleo Guy, so make sure that you tune in.
Coming up on The Shift.
What do you think it means for someone to express their authentic self?
To express our authentic self means to live without fear.
So if tomorrow the entire of Australia went paleo, snap, collapse of industry.
I wouldn't say collapse, I would say an adaptation.
What did you experience in them when they went back to that hunter-gatherer lifestyle?
It was the joy. It was, again, the expression of being alive.
When we're trying to make a shift in our lives, all it can take is one small thing to set us in the right direction. Perhaps for someone you know, it could be listening to this podcast. My hope is to get this into as many ears as possible. So if you know somebody that's stuck and needs to make a shift, why not send them this podcast? It could be the one thing that sets them in the right direction.